With over 10 sacks this past season and potentially one of the highest ceilings as a pass rusher in this year's draft class, Princely Umanmielen is who we're going to be discussing today, so let's get it right into it. As always, before we get into today's video, shout out to our sponsor, BetUS. Use code YouTube150 to get a 150% deposit match on your first deposit, 125% on your next two deposits up to $2,000. As you can see right now, they have the futures, betting lines, and for the NFL draft, these numbers have moved a little bit, but I think this is so interesting to follow along with because who knows if the Titans are even be picking at one by the time they get on the clock. So just being the number one overall pick, the fact that you can bet Shedeur Sanders at plus 550, I think is the best value right now. Travis Hunter, I think, is sneaky because I think that, maybe somebody makes a trade just saying this is the best player in the draft, but I don't feel like that they would get up to number one. Someone's going to move to number one for a quarterback. So I feel good about having Shedeur Sanders behind him at plus 550. I think that there's a lot of teams that could feel like he's the best quarterback in this year's class. So for me, if you want to get at value, I personally think that would be at Shedeur Sanders plus 550. But don't take my word for it, man. Go over to BetUS, check it out for yourself. If you're looking for a sports book, use code YouTube150. Now, let's get to today's video. So yes, we're going to dive into Princely Umanmielen, the edge rusher out of Ole Miss, at just over 6'4", 264 pounds, over 34-inch arms, has fantastic length. That's a really good build for a stand-up edge rusher that transferred to Ole Miss from Florida and was incredibly productive. I already touched on over 10 sacks, over a 22% pass rush win rate, and over an 8% run-stop win rate, according to Pro Football Focus. Now, this is one of those interesting players because he's a little bit older. He's a 5-year senior that feels like there's so much that needs to get polished, and there's some real questions heading into the next level. You wonder how much he can tap into. Is he just going to be a sub-package piece? Can he become a 3-down starter in the NFL? How quickly can he become that piece in the NFL? Yet, he was such a dynamic and productive pass rusher that as much polish that feels like it needs to be added, it's hard to not look at him and say, man, this is going to translate. Like, he's going to get after the quarterback, and he's going to be productive because he has some athleticism and some flexion in his game. Feels like it's really hard to find when you look at the NFL draft. That's what Princely presents at this time. But with that being said, let's dive into this breakdown. Final grade coming at the end, and let's start off with the first step explosion. I think he has a very good first step explosion, first step get off. The big thing here is the stride depth that he carries. And this will show up specifically when working around the arc of the pocket, is his ability to essentially build speed, build momentum, continue to build on long strides as he's attacking the quarterback. He also showcases great timing at times. He has an anticipation for when the snap count is going to happen. There's other times when it feels a lot more average, when he doesn't get that kind of early lean, early jump on the play. But when he does, it's fantastic. And there are examples against multiple different teams of him simply just beating an offensive tackle to their spot because of his ability to anticipate the snap count and then cover that much depth off the line of scrimmage. I also do like, from a run game perspective, just a side note, the way that he squeezes down the line of scrimmage off the backside. We're going to talk about run defense and some of the issues there, but that is one thing that I do like as a run defender, is he does a fantastic job discipline-wise of closing off airspace on the backside of a tackle. I think that's going to translate well to the NFL, but his reactive long strides to pass sets are incredibly impactful and incredibly threatening, and he's pretty good in terms of reactiveness to where a run scheme is going and simply just not being in a spot where he's completely pushed out of the play because his first step was late or it was slow. Take advantage of offensive linemen if they get out of their stance too late. Now, that may show up less in the NFL, but it definitely showed up in college. And you know how they kind of cracked down on the rules this past season. So do like that he has really nice closing range. You can get him out in space. He has some long speed that he can, again, build up. I don't think he has some of the footwork or the man coverage upside where, as a stand-up piece, you'd want to put him in that role too often. When he did get in that spot, it didn't look great, but he does have some of that closing range to cover a lot of field. It helps him a ton when you talk about tracking the quarterback down behind the line of scrimmage. He ties to that with his fantastic length, which can open a lot of closing upside as well. Step over gaps, slant inside. This will show up on stunt usage as well, or just reading through where the ball is going, where the running back is going, and then being able to step over top of blocks, because there is an awareness typically of play the run first, then get into my pass rush sets if it's not a third down. And while sometimes I think the transition of playing the run, the rush, and the passer isn't really noticeable, and that's a problem, and it kind of stalls out, there is a awareness to play the run first. I will get to more of the discipline aspect in a second, but I do think that there is an inconsistency when you talk about reading the mesh point, being consistent within his discipline there, and simply more so he just feels like he's attacking and kind of just picking one of the two options rather than actually reading through the play and who actually has the football and being instinctive in terms of reading the mesh point. Now, in terms of his play strength, this is an area where I was a little bit disappointed. I do feel like there was flashes of, okay, he has something here, but I have a slightly below average grade right now in terms of play strength. I do think there's things that he does well. Like typically, for example, I think he shifts his weight pretty well into contact as a run defender within the lower body. You'll see when he takes on pullers. He's not usually getting pushed back at the point of attack, taking on offensive linemen head on. And that's one of the best aspects of his game, to be honest, as a run defender as of now, that he can kind of shift his weight forward, consistently plays with a very wide base at the point of attack, which helps him as well create some of that stoutness. And I do think in terms of play strength as a pass rusher, it will flash with his ability to really roll his hips through contact and create a little bit of force through the ground. Now, he does not take full advantage of that whatsoever as of now. He doesn't feel like a very explosive, heavy hands type of player at the point of attack. He doesn't feel very powerful as a pass rusher or really as a run defender, but there is some stoutness, and it does feel like occasionally you'll see his hips and his ability to kind of drive through and create a little bit of initial pushback when you watch him as a pass rusher, say on stunt opportunities. But I ended up giving him the slightly below average grade here because I think his leg drive is just average at best as a pass rusher from what we've seen so far. One of the biggest issues I have is that he doesn't seem to tie his hands and feet really well together in terms of maximizing the force that he can really specifically create from the upper body or the lower body, transitioning, creating power from the ground. There isn't a lot of that. It feels like his hands and feet are kind of on their own timelines and they're just doing their own thing. They may sync together, but into that initial contact, his hands will be a little bit reactive to the placement. His feet don't typically tend to follow along, so it just feels like there's really no force that's being created. There's not a lot of knockback at the point of attack, and for those reasons, I have him slightly below average here. I think there's flashes that this could be sufficient at the next level. I don't think it's going to be great at the next level. I don't think it'll ever really get there, but I think it can be sufficient. With his length and his size, you want to believe that maybe as a weak side stand-up rusher, that this is something that potentially could be okay in the NFL. Pass rusher, this is one of the most difficult spots for me to grade because I think there's a lot of polish that needs to take place. So I didn't want to give him a fantastic grade, but he wins, and he wins a lot. I think he's a good pass rusher as of now, and this is the category specifically that if a team takes him higher, going to be the reason why. It's because they're going to be buying into he can get after the quarterback. And in the NFL, those guys are hard to find, and they always have a role. Even if you can't play the run, if you can get after the quarterback, there's usually a role there. And again, he does have the size to be someone that potentially could be serviceable against the run. I don't think he'll be an enforcer against the run, but he could be absolutely serviceable against the run at the next level. So as a pass rusher, why have him with a good grade now? There's a lot of reasons for that. One of my little issues, just to hit on really quickly here, I don't think he plays with a lot of slither, which is weird based on his play style that this doesn't show up that much. I think especially when you see him rushing from the inside, you'll see it on stunts, the ability to kind of slip through gaps. I don't see enough slither. I think some of this is also some of the way that he goes about his pass rush plan and the technique as a pass rusher, but I don't think there's a ton of fluidity there when splitting gaps, and you'll see that he'll tend to lose a little bit of balance, I think, when working some of those close quarter situations. But what he does do well is he is capable of working close quarter situations and squeezing and playing tight to an offensive tackle in their sets. This is one of, I think, his biggest strengths, his ability to press an offensive tackle, work off of that, typically around the edge, but being able to do it close to the offensive lineman as well, really close a lot of airspace. He's capable of doing that. Now, I don't think he always ties it together incredibly well, which leads to the issue if he constantly has guys landing clean strikes, throwing him off his pass rush plan, allowing for recovery opportunities when he clearly has a step on an offensive tackle, because I don't think he keeps himself clean. And as we get to the hand usage, I think that's a really big problem right now. However, he can play in some of those close quarter situations. A lot of that comes back to the bend. He has a bend ability to really flatten the top of the arc, which comes back to the ankles, and you'll see that, the ability to kind of close off the top of his pass rush lanes. And there's multiple examples where I thought, okay, he's going to get pushed out of the pocket, and he'd get back into the play because of some of that ankle flexion that does pop up. The adaptive, which is a problem, reading through how the offensive tackle sets, being adaptive off of that. I think he leaves opportunities to potentially win inside. You don't get nearly enough inside wins. I think there's just not enough adaptiveness in terms of his plan, where the quarterback is on the play, but there is some instinctual feel, probably for the most part, as a pass rusher, when he feels a running back work out of the backfield and his ability to kind of step away from that, work into an offensive tackle immediately to avoid kind of that extra contact and continue to try to keep his pass rush plan alive. And he's gotten a couple of wins that I noted from this past season off of that alone. He also has a nice little club to dip move. Feels like it's going to be very diverse when you start watching Princely, but it also kind of fades out in terms of the actual diversity of success that he has as a pass rusher. But one thing that he does well is the torso flexion, the dip ability. That's really typically leans on, tied along with that club move first to try to work around the pass rush arc. That's typically his go-to as a pass rusher. And he has a capability to play with pretty good pad level into his speed to power conversions to get underneath of pads. There just isn't nearly enough power at the point of attack. To me, again, that comes back to entry. There are times when it feels like his hands aren't even connecting with an offensive lineman in those spots, and you just don't feel that power and force being created through the lower body or through the ground into contact. It doesn't feel that at all. You don't feel any pop in those spots, but you do see his ability to drop his pad level and get underneath pads, which can open up, you want to believe, some speed to power conversions, more half-man opportunities, which he occasionally would take advantage of this past season, but his entry to me is just off. It's off too consistently. I love his stop-start ability. This is huge because his ability to get up to speed, gain ground, create really big strides, that allows for a nice stop and start ability where he can press an offensive tackle and then work outside and stride out, crossover move or a sidestep move, cover a lot of depth, and it allows him to win in a variety of ways, inside and outside. He hasn't tapped as much to the inside. However, when you do see the flashes of him playing an offensive tackle who sets a little bit more shallow, he could press that tackle, work back outside, and create a lot of depth and potentially open up opportunities to win around the corner. He does have an ability to sustain that speed around the corner. I think carrying back to some of the bend that he has specifically in the ankles, specifically if he's clean, he can get definitely knocked off his pass rush route. But if he doesn't get knocked off his pass rush route, say the lean kind of taps in, then that's a point where he can continue kind of build up speed around the arc and he becomes incredibly threatening, which led to so much production, even when he's not getting sacks, just constantly getting some sort of hand on the quarterback where he wouldn't always finish. He'd get a little overran out of the pocket, but he would constantly get a hand on the quarterback and at very least spill the quarterback out of the play. I also think that his spin pass rush counter is going to be one of the biggest elements for him early, because if this wasn't there, he'd be super limited in terms of ways that he wins. But this opens up so much variety. Now, I don't think he always places it correctly in terms of when he gets to it, but the spin through some of the real knee flexion that he carries, maybe not as much as the bend, but the flexibility there, specifically in the lower body, opens up a spin counter that's pretty quick, and typically it doesn't have a lot of unnecessary footwork tied to it. Again, I don't think it's always maybe as sudden. There is some adaptiveness that you'll feel where, okay, offensive tackle, he can't get the edge, so he wants to try to get back to the spin move. One of the biggest disappointments to me is I think he showcases some of the ability to play lean, right, and have an opportunity to not allow guys to get clean strikes because he can play a little bit more skinny, but I don't think that shows up nearly enough, and too often he allows himself to be kind of a target when rushing the passer, and he doesn't make himself incredibly skinny as a pass rusher. His effort also, to me, tends to kind of pull back a little bit when you talk about the motor, which I think is slightly above average because he'll pursue plays, but I think his motor tends to pull back, say if it's slide protection or run to pass transitions. There's not like a heavy urgency. It feels like to continue to work on the play, and everything kind of just feels like it stalls out and the play kind of dies off and it just ends for him. His knee bend, which is just to me average at this point, can tend to get him knocked off his spot as a pass rusher specifically, and absolutely he will overrun the pocket. That will definitely happen. The ability to really sell the top of the pass rush, and this comes back to, again, some of that upper body flexion with the ankle bend that's tied into this, is that he has some of that torso flexion to really shift his shoulders, get an offensive tackle to bite upfield. He has some discipline that you'll see as well when he's pressing vertically to then shift his shoulders and then get back inside. There's some discipline there, and there's also some flexibility within the upper body that he can really help sell himself as he's working towards the edge of the pocket. He brings great length at the point of attack, which is probably the best attribute that he has as a stunt rusher right now when working outside to inside, is the length that he carries as well as the body control, which I think is great. It might be the best part of his game right now is his body control, not as much the agility. But when he works back inside, he can stop on a dime, and he has the length where he could typically get into your offensive lineman a little bit off balance, and that kind of length is super disruptive in passing lanes, and it also gives him opportunity to lock out, though again, I don't think he does that nearly enough, but it does give him the opportunity to lock out. So those two things go hand in hand pretty well as a stunt rusher specifically. I do like his footwork, ability to potentially create angles as a pass rusher, play tight to offensive linemen, not have to run with a ton of space out wide, though again, I don't think the plan is always great. I do like that upside that he does carry. Problem is, I think he's a little bit predictable, and I also don't think there's a ton of assertiveness when you see him in kind of his jabs as a pass rusher trying to set an offensive lineman up. There's not a lot of assertiveness there. I think a big issue for that is his agility is maybe just average. You'll see it on like cut blocks. He'll get tripped up and fall on the ground. Don't think he has great agility, so his shake at the top of the rush isn't fantastic, which makes him a little bit more of a straightforward linear rusher that has a spin counter off of it, and I think that leads to some of the lack of inside wins. Though he covers a lot of depth and he can definitely sink down a little bit, some of the lack of just shake within his game I think shows up as an issue, and it shows up as an issue without some of that assertiveness, the ability to kind of set up offensive tackles, get guys to bite inside or outside of just being disciplined upfield and having the stride depth and the ability to cover that much ground that he can peel an offensive lineman open so that he can open up a spin counter potentially off of it. His change of pace is the big thing there. He has an ability to change pace as he's working through his pass rush attempts. His matches at the top of the rush, and it could be a little bit of an issue for offensive tackles to potentially stay square. He can get guys to constantly pry open because his ability to change pace as a pass rusher. I think that's one noticeable thing, is so much of what he does is through his footwork. So much of what he does is through that speed, maybe a little bit of length, but also some of the bend. It's not as much nearly at all through what he does with his hands or anything with his upper body or the inconsistencies when he does dip in the timing. It's so much through the lower body, and I think that shows up because you'll see it against tight ends. When he gets isolated with tight ends, it almost looks worse than working on an offensive tackle. It's like, where is the dominance? There's no dominance over tight ends. It doesn't show play strength. It doesn't show hand usage. In those spots, there's guys that are pretty athletic that you kind of just settle in front of him, and you see how much he really relies on his footwork rather than really tapping into the other aspects of a pass rusher, which I think shows up when he gets singled up with tight ends. You'll see it at times. He doesn't even feel like he has a pass rush plan at times when he has to win inside, or here comes a chip block from a tight end, or here's a slot that steps inside to kind of down block. Like, there doesn't even feel like there's a great plan that he even gets to. It doesn't seem like he knows what to get to in those spots. There is no immediate, like, okay, bull rush, let's just run this guy backwards. That isn't even an option for him. Like, he doesn't even get to that. So there's times where when you give him help, it doesn't even feel like he has a plan necessarily to get to. I do think as he's rushing upfield, then he can step inside running backs and show some awareness. He clearly has the awareness. It just doesn't feel like he has a great plan when he's kind of squeezed back inside to deal some of those close quarters with an offensive tackle. He is his best. The wider alignments let him press the guys vertically and really sell his vertical sell to open everything else up as a pass rusher right now. Do like, however, though, I think with some of the hips that I touched on earlier, he can create adequate force there, and that he can transition his hips, and you'll see this specifically in coverage, the ability to kind of open up the transition speed within his hips. That does open up half-man opportunities. The ability to create outside shoulder, potentially create some pressure, potentially create the pass rush and collapse the pocket. I saw that a little bit, didn't see it enough. Ability to kind of dip those strikes from offensive tackles. Now, I think the timing is great here typically. It's just that I would like to see him utilize his hands more. Right now, he kind of leans more so on dipping underneath a shot attempt from an offensive tackle, and if they don't connect, then he's good. But if they connect at all, it feels like his pass rush kind of stalls out because there's not a lot of hand usage that strings together whatsoever. But he does have a nice little shoulder dip that he ties around the arc, so you can see that what he's clearly done really well, he's done at a very high level, and he's got that pretty much dialed in. It's just, can we tap into everything else that could potentially be here as a pass rusher that feels like it's not getting tapped into? So it's going to pull back his production, no question, in the NFL. But he does what he does at a very high level. It's just there's so much that I don't think has even been touched on as a pass rusher right now. Like the body control that he plays with, again, as I touched on in stunts, he does have the hips to open. Talk about his ability to get flat. You'll see that as a run defender as well. I just don't think he has great lateral shake. Average in terms of fluidity, you'll see it in his coverage drops as well, or his ability to deal with cut blocks, deal with traffic around his feet. I don't think he constantly takes advantage of offensive tackles within some of their quicker sets. So that leads me to the hand usage, where I think that he is very below average. Like, I think that he is just above kind of a poor grade here for right now for me for hand usage. It's one of the lowest grades I've given out so far to a player, and maybe the lowest. That's because I don't think he does much well with his hands. And it's weird because he has the body control, which to stop on the dime, he has the flexion, he has the speed around the arc, he has the change of pace, he has the length. He just doesn't use his hands well whatsoever as a run defender or as a pass rusher, which I think is the problem. There's a couple things, like first off, the length is noticeable, and it can impact pass lanes. But for me, number one, they're not heavy at the point of attack, which plays back to that play strength that he brings to the table. Doesn't have very efficient hand or effective hand usage when he works through his side steps to kind of tie those two things together and be effective there. Doesn't typically utilize his hands to even attack when he's working past an offensive lineman. So some guys have that skill set to continue working their hands while also continue getting ground. He doesn't even tend to use his hands very much in those spots. Again, it's more so just kind of leaning on the shoulder dip. There's a little bit of a shoulder dip there. There's a little bit of a club move that he'll get into, but it's more of kind of the rip around the edge rather than really working any kind of move or being able to kind of flip his or being able to kind of transition to the offensive lineman, give me a two-hand swipe, just give me anything. Like, there's not a lot that really goes on there. Allows him to get punched off his path as a pass rusher because he doesn't keep himself clean. So it allows offensive linemen that if they just have an accurate strike and they don't miss, they're going to land and it will slow down. Wanted to see more of a long arm move. I thought once I saw it, then I looked back, I was like, yeah, I didn't even see it there. I think that would be perfect for his game, is a little bit of a long arm. I think he has the flexion to do it. I think he has some of the bend to do it. I think he clearly has the length to do it. I would like to see some sort of long arm transition move that he could get to, Haven't really noticed that. I think that needs to be really developed. Doesn't tend to anticipate, I feel like, strikes from offensive linemen incredibly well either. And when you get to the run defense aspect, the big problem with his hands is that they almost feel like they're collapsing on contact. Like they don't create much lockout whatsoever. Feels like he doesn't have that kind of long arms, but you see that he does, but they collapse on contact. They kind of roll over themselves and they don't tie well with their feet. There's not a lot of like sturdiness or heaviness at the point of attack. Everything just kind of feels like a collapse over. And because of that, his hand usage isn't super effective as a run defender either. Shed ability to me is below average right now, just getting off blocks. Again, the length is the best aspect of this to me. He also has an ability to adapt his hands to entry. Like he feels moving targets of offensive linemen to kind of try to set himself a little bit better potentially on the play. And he doesn't lunge very often. Now, sometimes I feel like he'll kind of look like he closes his eyes where he loses track of where the ball actually is through taking on a block, through a take on technique, save a puller. But what he does well here is that early on the play, he tries to set his vision. So feels it's run play inside. He can feel the puller and he'll step back across inside. He has kind of the torso flexion to kind of dip his shoulders and slide over top of gaps, which allows him to be successful and potentially make plays that are a little bit beyond where he even was without even really creating much of a clean shed. A lot of lockout that you see right now to be able to kind of stand and hold his ground. Knee flexion is going to be capable because it allows him to kind of slip blocks and potentially hold his gap at the point of attack a little bit better at the next level with some development there. How he takes on half man when he's dealing with pullers. He doesn't typically take on the full man, so he gives himself a little bit of an opportunity. But the smooth side steps, the body control, kind of the feel for that is great because that's kind of where he wins right now. He wins with avoiding, with a little bit more slipperiness rather than actually kind of stack shed. That doesn't show up a ton in his game right now. Not very violent in his hands. There's no like aggressiveness in attacking, offensive blocks. It doesn't feel like that. It feels like he's kind of just waiting for everything to happen while also positioning himself. You'll see some of the limitations like working on the backside of run plays, but to also slip back over blocks. So for me, that's the weird thing is I think there's so much development needs to happen for a 5-year senior. It's concerning. It's very concerning. But I also think the fact that he can win and when he does well, he does really well. And I think the traits that he carries and the athleticism that he carries is in some ways kind of rare for a pass rusher. I don't think you're going to find a lot of guys with that, which I think is going to add a lot. I think he's going to be one of the more all over the place kind of pass rushers this year, where could he have a path to round 1? Maybe someone falls in love with the upside as a pass rusher. I think it's possible. I don't think he has the bend that a guy like Will McDonald had, but it's very capable, and he has the strides and the length like this, and he has the build 265 at 6'4" with 34-inch arms. This is fantastic. To me, he's not awful in any of the critical factors. Like he's at very least can be sufficient, I think, in terms of play strength, and he can get after the quarterback, and he's got really good first step get off. It's all of the positional traits which feel like they need some big time development, but he carries the body control along with it, and he can also tackle, make closing plays. You see the run stop rate. I don't think there's a ton of instinctiveness as a run defender, finding the ball, reading through the run scheme. It's more so just kind of positioning himself. Then he kind of feels like he's losing track of where the ball is actually going. His discipline to me is average. His motor slightly above average. So I don't think he excels in someone like the, wow, he's just the hardest worker on the field either, which is a problem. He's a little bit more rotational at times with Ole Miss, but he was productive, and he's been productive for years in college. So for me, overall, this is one of the harder spots to give a grade at. I'm assuming this one's going to change for me. It just depends on who your team is and what exactly you're looking for. But if you want upside purely as a pass rusher, he might be one of your top edge rushers in this year's class. Like he could be one of your top handful of edge rushers that are, you just like him more because of that upside. But for a well-rounded 3-down player, there's going to be development that's needed. I ended up giving him 6.21 grade as my final grade here. But again, I think it's going to depend on team, and I think this grade could change for me. And if you're really looking for a pass rusher, it wouldn't hurt to take a swing on Princely. So with that being said, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Shout out to BetUS for sponsoring today's video, and I'm out.